Okay, thanks very much, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next panel, which is a panel on Australian psychedelic research. So we've got a collection of very interesting psychedelic researchers today who are going to talk a bit about some of the things that they're involved with, and then we'll also get into discussing maybe some of the prospects for psychedelic research in the future. So we'll kick straight into things, and what I'll do first of all is I'll ask each panelist just to introduce yourself briefly and to talk a little bit about what psychedelic research you're currently involved with and maybe how that came about. So I'll pass on first of all to Margaret Ross, if you're okay to introduce yourself, please.
So my name's Dr. Margaret Ross. I work at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. I work with palliative care patients and oncology patients, and yeah, very, very happy to be part of the EGA day today. Would you like me to just go ahead and start talking about the research that we're doing?
Yeah, if you could just tell us a bit about the study and what's happening.
No worries. And first of all, a big plug to EGA, because EGA 2017 Symposium was actually the thing that inspired me to get this started in the first place, rather than waiting for somebody else to bring it to Australia. So essentially, I'm one of the principal investigators for our first psilocybin-assisted therapy study. We're investigating the use of psilocybin-assisted therapy for palliative patients who have existential distress or depression and anxiety as a result of having a terminal illness. And we're thrilled to be able to offer that to our palliative patients. And one of the things is it's not actually just for St Vincent's patients. We actually have had interest from patients who are from all over Australia, so we can offer that to people who would like to access this treatment. We were obviously very excited by the trials that had been conducted at Johns Hopkins and NYU with cancer patients over in the US, where they had very rapid and dramatic results in reducing depression and anxiety in their cancer patients. So I was, based on those results, which was so compelling, I was convinced that someone would bring it to Australia. But as of 2018, they hadn't. So I reached out to Martin Williams, who you'll hear from very shortly, and PRISM, and we started hatching a plan to bring it to Australia. So essentially, while we're informed by those studies overseas, we do have a couple of key differences. The major one being that our study is offering this treatment to people who have non-malignant terminal disease, so not just cancer patients, because it's not only cancer patients that have death anxiety or depression as a result of having a terminal illness. So we really wanted to offer it to anyone with palliative care needs, and my understanding is that we're the first ones internationally to offer that, so we're pretty excited to hopefully contribute to the science in that way. So essentially, we started in January. We aim to recruit 40 participants who have a terminal illness, who are distressed by their terminal illness. And we offer 2 dose sessions to each participant. The first one being, obviously, because it's a phase 2 clinical trial, we need to demonstrate the efficacy of a treatment. So we have to offer what we call a randomized control procedure, where we have, participants and also the therapists are blind to what the participants are actually getting. They may get a placebo or they may get the active treatment. So that way we can demonstrate the efficacy of the treatment that we're offering to our patients. So that's the first dose. But then several weeks later, we actually offer all of our participants what's known as an open label dose, so that everybody gets an opportunity to experience the full treatment. If you're lucky enough to get the psilocybin, the active treatment, in the first dose session, then you get it twice. So that's essentially what we're doing. And unfortunately, we had commit screening and recruiting, and then COVID put the kibosh on everything, unfortunately. So at the moment, we're still we're waiting for the hospital directives to allow us to recommence. But we've certainly had an enormous amount of interest from all over Australia, and actually internationally as well. So, and we've had an enormous support as well. So we're really, really keen to get back into it. We were starting to see some really quite promising experiences with the people that we had started doing the work with. So yeah, fingers crossed it's not too far away.
Thanks so much. It's a really exciting project. I'm sure I speak for everyone when we're just delighted to hear that this is happening and that it's being run so well and in such a careful way. So we might come back and talk more about the study a bit, but let's hear from some of our other panelists. Chris, I might head to you next. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you've been working on.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Vince. And thanks everyone for organising this. This is fantastic. So I'm here to represent the humanities in psychedelic research. All right, yeah. So thanks, Vince, and thanks everyone who's been involved in organising this. This is a fantastic thing to do. So I'm here to represent the humanities in psychedelic research. I guess I'm a philosopher, and my primary appointment is as a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia. So I'm based in Perth, but that was originally a full-time position, and I went to half-time at UWA a bit over a year ago because I got a second position, a half-time postdoc research position on a government-funded project funded by the Australian Research Council at the University of Adelaide, which is my alma mater, where I did my PhD. And that's a project that's being led by Philip Gerrans, who's Professor of Philosophy at Adelaide, and it's called Philosophical Perspectives on Psychedelic Psychiatry. And I think it's worth noting that that project exists and was funded about $350,000 by the Australian Research Council. So just as an indication of the fact that not only is there scholarship to be done in the humanities, but that this whole area of research is now being taken sufficiently seriously that the ARC will invest that kind of money in a philosophical, theoretical project on the new wave of psychedelic research in psychiatry. And so what that project is really about, so the grant was applied for by Philip Gerrans and international collaborators, other philosophers, including Thomas Metzinger and Lisa Bortolotti, and it's essentially based on some collaborative research that Philip and I did looking at the nature of ego dissolution in psychedelic experience from a theoretical philosophical standpoint. So we use tools from the predictive processing theory of cognition to develop an account of what exactly is going, well, first of all, an account of self-representation in the brain and how it might underlie the sense of self in ordinary experience that then can explain the different ways in which the sense of self is affected in psychedelic states and how that might have therapeutic consequences. And so that's sort of in that we try to connect up all the different levels of explanation and description. So explain how what's going on at the molecular level links to cognitive information processing, and then through to the phenomenological level, the level of experience. And then we also tried to use that to plug the sort of psychedelic research into some traditional philosophical debates about, first of all, can there be selfless states of consciousness, so states of consciousness that completely lack any sense of self? And secondly, the metaphysics of the self. So does the self actually exist or not? Is it an illusion, as has been claimed in Buddhism and various other traditions? And so the 3-year project that we're now doing is basically to expand and extend that work, looking at the philosophy of ego dissolution and how that might help us to explain both psychedelic therapy, the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics, and kind of philosophical controversies over the nature and existence of the self. So I'm finishing up a book at the moment. It's hopefully going to be sent off by the end of the month. It's supposed to come out next year with Oxford University Press. And in that, I take this general approach to looking at the psychedelic state through the lens of predictive processing theory. And I try to use it to answer some other questions about psychedelic therapy. For instance, does it intrinsically depend on sort of changing people's metaphysical beliefs to believe in a cosmic consciousness? Or is it actually sort of fundamentally about something a bit more grounded and down to earth? And I argue that it is. It's more about changing the sense of self than inducing beliefs in a cosmic consciousness or a divine reality. And then I use that to make an argument that, you know, even from a naturalistic or from the perspective of philosophical naturalism or materialism, the philosophical view that denies that there is any transcendent reality, psychedelic states can still have epistemic benefits. They can still lead to genuine knowledge gain and veridical insights into one's own mind and the world. So that's what I'm doing.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris. I mean, it's I was just saying thanks, Chris. I don't know if you caught anything I was saying, but I was just quickly saying that, as you said, it's a really nice indicator of where we're at to with psychedelic research, that the Australian Research Council is funding a philosophy project such as what you're doing with a big discovery grant like that. It's a really nice sign of how seriously some of this work is taken, and a good indicator of where we might be in the future. So thanks for sharing a bit about that. We might move on now. I'll head over to you next, Stephen. If you can talk a little bit about your work and what you're up to at the moment, that would be great.
Sure. So my background is in clinical psychology. I specialised in working with people experiencing problems associated with alcohol and other drugs, and particularly people experiencing those problems comorbid with other mental health issues. Like Marg, I have to give a shout out to EGA because I was completely unaware of psychedelic science until about 10 or 12 years ago when I attended an EGA forum, actually to test out some ideas I had about other drug-related research that I was doing. And from there became really excited about what was happening internationally and the prospects of what we might do in Australia. And as a consequence of EGA, of course, PRISM formed. And so in many respects, EGA is the godfather to PRISM and you know, the research that's come from that. Since that point in time, PRISM's I've been part of PRISM's efforts to get an MDMA trial for PTSD up. We've had 2 failures. Well, let's reframe that. 2 learning experiences, and are currently moving forward probably as far as we've ever progressed in that space here in Australia. Though I can't go into too much detail in terms of where that's at, but again, very optimistic. In 2017, I moved to Edith Cowan University as a senior lecturer, and through that role, I've been supervising honours students projects looking at microdosing, the role of psychedelics in empathy, the role of psychedelics in environmental behaviour, understanding urban-based ayahuasca use, and other psychedelic research through engaging with students. So that's been exciting as well, and I guess that's where I'm currently at the moment.
Great, thanks, Steve. That all sounds great. You mentioned PRISM in some of your explanations of the things that you're doing. So maybe we'll switch over to Martin now. You can talk about what you've been up to and maybe a bit more background to PRISM and where PRISM is up to.
You got me there. Thanks, Vince. Yeah, so thanks very much to everybody for coming along. It's really brilliant to have everyone on board, and I think we've got the heavy hitters of the Australian psychedelic research scene here. So very, very pleased to have people involved. Thank you. And look, it's really been an exciting time. It is an exciting time. I don't want to channel Malcolm Turnbull in any way, but there's never been a more exciting time for psychedelic research in Australia. It's really happening now, but of course it's taken quite a long period of time to actually get us to this point. So I don't know how many people here know me, but those who do will know that I'm a sort of a jack of a couple of trades, but certainly a master of not very many at all. So I'm in the very fortunate position as being a founding member and president of PRISM to have an overview of several emerging and evolving research programs that have really come through in the last 2 to 3 years, of course, including the St Vincent's Melbourne clinical trial. And we're really very excited about that. So really, psychedelic research in Australia has been pretty quiet, as most people would know, in line with the rest of the world's research, but we've been doing our best to get on board. PRISM, as Steve mentioned, was established, well, 10 years ago now, just very close to 10 years ago, to see if we could make an Australian contribution to the global research effort in psychedelic medical research, as well as probably broader psychedelic research as well. It's taken us a little while to really get the momentum together to bring something to clinical trial, but I think things are really looking very promising from here on in. As Marg said, it was really the EGA 2017 conference which brought so many people together, and I think that was the pivotal point for all of us to really realise. Chris was there, of course. Steve was there. I think pretty much all of us were there and joined in a fantastic space. So that was a very special time for us. But really, I think we've got a long way to go. Of course, we're really just starting out. And as I said, I've got an overview of several research projects which are just in the very gestational stage. And of course, I have lots of dreams for other interesting things to come about as well. Certainly, the therapeutic medical research is first and foremost for us, I think, because that is a key way of legitimizing and broadening the acceptance of psychedelics in society more generally. My own particular interest is in molecular pharmacology because that's my formal sort of academic current research background. And so I'd love to see even initiate research programs which are continuing the pivotal work of Sasha Shulgin so many years ago, really studying what we call the structure-activity relationships of drugs and their psychological effects, essentially, and then potentially extending that research into both therapeutic but also much broader applications. So that's where my own interest in research lies. I think we're, as I said, at the very beginning, but we've got a long way to go, but we're very, very happy to have achieved what we have so far in the last couple of years.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Martin. So as you can see, we've got quite a interesting collection of researchers here. We've sort of embedded in different forms of research and working on a few different things. So I might loop back now with a few more questions for each of you just to delve some more into the work that you're doing. So I'll go back to you first, Marg Ross, and just ask a little bit more about your study. There's already been a few questions I can see floating in along the lines of how difficult was it to navigate the bureaucracy to get this project going? How did you get those approvals? One person in particular asked, do you think that it was a fluke that this got approved? Or, you know, is this kind of an indication that things maybe aren't as hard to do this research? Maybe if you could talk a little bit about your reflection from the inside on these sort of bureaucratic issues.
Sure. I think to a certain degree luck certainly helped, but look, to go back, and I think I'd like to echo what Martin just spoke about, and also Steve. The fact is that this has been, you know, a decade or more of advocacy and talking about the science and dialoguing that really enabled this to actually get off the ground. Had we not had that, I don't think I would have had, I wouldn't call it as an easier run, but it wouldn't have been as accessible, I think, at all. In terms of how easy it was more just sort of, I think from was pretty sequential. Obviously, there were things that we had to do, and I can tell you that it sounds pretty dry on the face of it. You know, obviously getting your ethics approval and then going to TGA and then going to state health in order to get various permits in place, and then federal for, you know, importation and so forth. But it kind of really ignores the sociocultural context, which we really had to consider, and that is that I had to speak with a number of key personnel, particularly in the hospital, with our ethics research governance unit, who were actually incredibly supportive. But we did this well before we even submitted an ethics proposal. The reason being is because we did have this unfortunate kind of hangover effect from, you know, the 60s Controlled Substances Act, that kind of thing. It's like, oh, okay, magic mushrooms, you're going to give that to dying people, great, chuckle. But you know, I think one of the interesting things is that if you go armed with good science to the academic and medical populations, they hear it and they see it, and they could see the potential of that. So it in that regard, it actually wasn't a difficult sell, because the preliminary results were remarkable. And again, these are early phase trial. Obviously, it still needs to get to phase 3 and to much larger numbers. But what we could see was quite compelling. So I was probably a little bit strategic in that regard, in that, you know, I got the heads of department on board, spoke with them at length about what we were hoping to do. Obviously, Martin was just a massive and key player in this for me, in terms of inviting me to or introducing me to other people overseas. USONA, who are very proud suppliers of our investigational product in kind. So, you know, these kind of connections were really, really key at the time, but also then just making sure we gave people, you know, good time to obviously know that we were coming and what we were planning to do. The other thing, I guess this is where the luck kind of happened. There were a few kind of big things that happened that year. I think Michael Pollan dropped his book in May of that year, so just before we submitted. So I think there was we were actually expecting quite a bit of backlash. We just didn't get it. And in fact, it went the other way. You know, and I was kind of warned, you know, yeah, this is going to make you that kooky psychologist that nobody wants to work with, all of that. It'll kill your career, it'll sink it. I didn't have to worry that much. I guess I wasn't that sort of professor with 20, 30 years of academia and however many 100 papers behind me. I didn't have to worry about that kind of career ruin in that way. I was very, very motivated about what we could potentially offer our patients who were just treatment refractory and really suffering. So yeah, I think it was the combination of years of advocacy in Australia, some really solid research coming out of the US, some very key personnel being supportive of this, and the hospital have been fantastic as well. And we have a very progressive ethics committee as well that were very supportive of the research. So I think from that point of view, I was extremely fortunate. But in terms of after that, then obviously we submitted to ethics. We were very lucky. We got conditional approval first hit. And as Martin will kind of attest, we worked very hard on that protocol, and we wanted it to be very, very difficult for them to say no to us. So we worked very hard on that, and then obviously tried to mitigate any safety concerns that they would have. Then after that, it was really just kind of administrative. We went to TGA, that was sort of ticked off, and then obtaining permits. Psilocybin is a Schedule 9 substance in Australia, so it's the highest classification, which made it hard. And obviously there are lots of licenses and permit sort of agreements to put in place before you can even supply it and store it and then prescribe it. So, and then with every single dose session that we have, 2 sessions per person, every single session we have to obtain a separate permit again. So it's very, very controlled. People are watching very closely, and as they should. We want to do a good job here in terms of, providing good, robust science, and hopefully the findings to support that. So it was certainly, it was arduous, but not for the reasons that people think. We didn't get the pushback. The departments were really helpful. They were very, very generous with their time. I was a bit of a stumble bum. I mean, I'd coordinated clinical trials before, but this was a Schedule 9, it's psilocybin, oh God, what do I do next? So, people that were involved in kind of helping me through the process, the departments were fantastic, I have to say. Doesn't mean it was easy, but it was made all the more helpful by having all of those conditions.
So once you got that provisional ethics approval, did you have to have any meetings or make representations to the TGA or other elements of government, or was that all just through paperwork after that stage?
No, it really, the clinical trial, obviously there's a couple of ways you can do it, but for the most part, you when you apply to do a clinical trial, the onus is really kind of on the research ethics committee that is approving the study. So a lot of the obviously the indemnity insurance, all that kind of stuff, that's being supplied by the hospital. They're the ones that are sort of accepting most of the risk of this. I will say risk, in terms of if you lodge what they call a clinical trial notification. Don't want to get into it, it's pretty messy, but that's the way that they're usually done. And so then the TGA then respond to that approval and obviously know that the hospital are providing obviously the approval and the governance overseeing the study.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about how that works.
Sorry, it was a bit wordy. I went past my 4 minutes, but yeah.
No, that's fine. I think people are really curious to hear about your experiences kind of being the first one out there to get this happening. So yeah, it's really valuable. I do want to shift gears slightly and throw back to Chris. Chris, you told us a little bit about how some of your work was in the humanities, and I think this is really an interesting angle on psychedelic research. I mean, we know that there are many, many people interested in this field now, and I sort of assume that when most people think about psychedelic research, they're probably more imagining empirical lab studies, people looking at the direct therapeutic effects. But as your work shows, there's whole other angles that people can take to do research and do work in this field. And so I wondered if you'd maybe tell us just a little bit more about what you think about the potential for research avenues in the humanities and what the humanities can contribute to psychedelic science or our general understanding of psychedelics.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the potential for psychedelic humanities is huge. I think it's like, even though obviously accruing more kind of solid empirical evidence for sort of therapeutic and transformative benefits in terms of, randomized controlled trials is the main thing that is going to shift a lot of people's perceptions of these substances at this point in time. On the other hand, humanities scholarship on psychedelics is probably the greatest sort of untapped area for people wanting to get into this field. And this is something that Tom Roberts, for instance, who's a professor of education, has been saying for quite some time. He's been kind of in various publications urging humanities scholars to take more of an interest in psychedelics because they represent, I mean, it goes both ways, right? So psychedelic state and psychedelic experiences represent a kind of vast, untapped area of inquiry for the humanities. And on the other hand, various humanities disciplines represent a set of tools and conceptual frameworks for understanding the psychedelic state that are relatively untapped within psychedelic research. And so, I mean, the work that I do is interesting because I'm a philosopher, and philosophy is a discipline that sits sort of, it's always been classified as a humanities discipline, but it really sits on the border of the humanities and the sciences anyway. And this is especially true of the type of philosophy I do, which comes out of the English language so-called analytic tradition that comes down from Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore and people like this. So this is a style of philosophy that was born in the early 20th century when philosophers in English-speaking countries started to ally themselves and align themselves more closely with the natural sciences and started to use tools like formal logic and mathematical logic and this kind of thing. And so the style of philosophy I do is really, it's very heavily steeped in the science, and it's kind of about trying to synthesize the findings of the scientific research and then bring that to bear, kind of get that to interface with, perennial philosophical debates and questions that go beyond what can be explicitly and definitively addressed by the empirical research. And so one of my great interests is the epistemic status of the psychedelic experience, right? So its status with respect to the acquisition of knowledge. So do psychedelic experiences lead to the acquisition of knowledge, directly or indirectly? So can you gain genuine knowledge about yourself or the world during the state itself, or indirectly via some of its long-term effects on cognition? Conversely, does it have epistemic risks or epistemic harms? Does it actually predispose people to become poorer at critical thinking or to adopt implausible beliefs about the world? And so this is one area where conceptual frameworks drawn from epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, can be brought into sort of fruitful dialogue with experimental research, and you can kind of try and operationalize some of these epistemological questions to an extent. I try and come up with testable hypotheses, and I've been involved with some collaborations along these lines. So I've worked with some of the researchers at the Imperial College London Centre for Psychedelic Research to develop scales to assess the effects of psychedelics on people's metaphysical beliefs, so their beliefs about the mind-body problem. But then once the data are in, they require analysis and interpretation. So you can kind of get this loop where you get sort of hypothesis generation coming out of disciplines like philosophy, leading to experimental research, and then the findings of that feed back into philosophy to analyze them and draw further conclusions from them. But another discipline, another humanities discipline that sort of sits on the border between the humanities and the social sciences where interesting work has been done is anthropology. And so there are people in Australia who have done a lot of this sort of thing. So Des Tremaki, I'm not sure where he is now, but I think he did his PhD at, might have been UQ, somewhere in Queensland, but he did an ethnographic study of smoked DMT use and its ritual and religious dimensions among DMT users in Australia. Another person is Robin Rodd, who I think is at James Cook University, who's done ethnographic studies of ayahuasca use. Nicholas Lunglitz, of course, an anthropologist who's now at the New School in New York, wrote a book called Neuropsychedelia, which is a really interesting ethnographic study of clinical psychedelic research, and he did field work in Franz Vollenweider's lab. He's also done field work, what he calls field work in neurophilosophy. So he's done research into the epistemic culture and the intellectual culture of the subfield of neurophilosophy, which is the kind of subfield in which I work. And he's gone and done extensive interviews with people like Thomas Metzinger and Patricia Churchland, who are kind of the leading exponents of this style of philosophy. But one discipline that is very, very underrepresented is literary studies. I mean, I only know one literary scholar who is involved in psychedelic research, and that's Neche Devenot, who has written some really interesting stuff about, for instance, the idea that poetic language might be, and so here again we have kind of humanities and the sciences coming into dialogue. So Neche, as well as being involved in some of the qualitative studies looking at participants' experiences in clinical trials, has also written stuff arguing that poetic language is an indispensable methodological tool in psychedelic science, because without it you can't accurately characterize your explanatory target, the phenomenon that you're investigating, because ordinary non-poetic language just isn't up to the job. History as well. So Erica Dick is someone who's written historical works looking at the history of psychedelic psychiatry. But again, I'm sure there are others, but I can't think offhand of any Australian historians, for instance, who are working on psychedelic related topics. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Wow. I mean, to just hear you go through all of those current researchers at the moment, it really demonstrates how many possibilities there are out there. Some of those names I'm familiar with, some of them I didn't know, and they all sound like they're doing really curious stuff. So it's really, I think, important and useful for us to see how there can be this interlinking between some of these humanities subjects and the science, and this symbiotic approach to progressing our knowledge. So thanks very much for that, Chris.
And the other thing I want to mention is if for people who are interested in getting involved in psychedelic research, there's a great advantage to doing it in the humanities, which is that you don't need to get ethics approval to give people drugs. So it's a lot easier in some ways.
Thanks, Chris. To kind of maybe hang on to that note, if there are people that are wanting to develop careers or research where they do want to give people drugs, maybe Stephen, if you could talk a little bit about any advice for people that want to get involved in psychedelic research. There's already been, I think, a couple of questions come through on the chat along this kind of theme, and it was in your introduction, it was interesting to hear that even though we sort of think about psychedelic research in Australia as if it's just starting up now, you mentioned a few studies you'd already been involved with over the past several years on relatively diverse topics. So, this work has been occurring previously, and there have been people who have found ways into this. Maybe you can talk a bit about what are useful skills or strategies that people might employ if this is the sort of thing they want to do.
Yeah, look, I think the first point is similar to what Chris was saying, is that this is a multidisciplinary area, and there are so many opportunities to engage in psychedelic science from all of the different disciplines. And so, Chris was sort of talking about anthropology and history, and then there's sociology, medicine. The multidisciplinary nature of it is well represented here in this group. We've got philosophy, pharmacology, psychology. There are just so many entry points to psychedelic science. And this is a question I get a lot from people. Probably I average 1 to 2 emails a week from people saying, how do I become a psychedelic researcher? And I guess there's a couple of things. The thing that resonated with me just then from what Chris said is it doesn't necessarily matter. There's opportunities to enter this from very different areas. So for myself, my PhD was from critical psychology. It looked at discourse analysis and linguistics and the way that drug use can be represented in society. It doesn't seem like that would be, a prerequisite to be involved in clinical trials. And I think so. One of the key messages I want to get across today is that, given that this is a multidisciplinary area, it doesn't really matter too much about the background that you enter it with, because there's a lot of this stuff is transferable skills that we learn through doing, masters, honors, PhDs, and things like that. And so my second point then is, given that it's multidisciplinary and there are multiple entry points, is that it's really important. What I say to people is choose an area that interests you, rather than particularly choosing an area where you think that's going to be an entry point to do psychedelic research, because you want to choose something that interests you, because you need that as a fallback. While, there is great momentum happening in this area. Lots of people want to work in this area as well, and so it's going to be hard work to do research in this area because of there being increasing interest from students coming through universities wanting to work in the area. And I say that also because outside of the research that Chris mentioned that's funded by the Australian government, I'm not aware of any other research in Australia that's currently being funded by the national or state governments. I think we've seen, we're increasingly seeing startup organisations that aren't really interested in conducting psychedelic research. Many may not overtly say this, but they see psychedelic medicines as a potential cash cow. And so it's, for me, the most important thing is to choose something that interests you, because ultimately these transferable skills that you're developing that can be applied in different ways, critical thinking skills, everything that you learn, you can apply. And I was thinking, also listening to Margaret, I don't know if it's a transferable skill, but Margaret's a lot more optimistic because she's sort of further ahead down the pathway than me. But I think in the last 6 months, I filled out more electronic forms for any other project than I've ever conducted in my life. And so I don't know what transferable skill filling out forms is, but if you want to conduct research in the clinical sciences here, you probably want to enjoy filling out lots and lots of forms. I concur. So you need to have a passion for filling out electronic forms. Seriously though, you want to choose something that interests you. It's something that you can fall back on, and it's something that you're going to be able to transfer into the space. And the final point I want to make is you want to choose that thing that interests you, because you need to do well in whatever it is that you're studying. So whether it's anthropology or sociology or social work, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you need to do well so that you can sort of move into those pathways through honours and masters and PhDs that are going to give you the transferable skills to be able to work in this space. And opportunities may arise at undergraduate level to do sort of an assignment, for example, on psychedelics. And I would always say to caution students to just think about that. It's a great opportunity because it's something you're interested in, but not everybody in academia is across this or sees it in the same way that we do. And so just be careful about those opportunities, and even all the way through from honours, masters, and PhD level, you don't need to be doing research in psychedelic science to be able to then do research in psychedelic science. It's essentially, you're just learning these skills that you can transfer later. And, some of Vince's students and some of my students are quite lucky because at their university, they've got somebody who's willing to supervise these sorts of projects. And so, I have supervised honours students who have looked at psychedelics in different ways, and I have supervised masters, and I'm supervising PhD students in this space. But I guess I'd just like to highlight that it's not necessary. And in fact, if you don't have sort of the people within the university where you're studying that are supportive of these sorts of things, it could actually do damage. Similar to what Margaret said, I've been in this game a little bit longer, and feel like I've been lucky, because this could have been this could have been career suicide for me as well. And I've just been really lucky that it hasn't been a career suicide, and it's worked in my favour. But I'd just like to temper students' enthusiasm by just thinking about that. You don't want to do yourself a disservice by putting yourself in a position where it might limit your future opportunities in terms of academia, because those future opportunities in academia, they are the things that are going to allow you to work in this space in the future.
Thanks for that, Stephen. I think that's really useful advice. Really kind of it's on this tension between, wanting to have more opportunities and encourage people to be doing this work, but to be taking a really sensible and strategic approach to doing it. Yeah, thanks. I'll move now back on to Martin, and I thought, Martin, to ask you maybe to just say a little bit more about the broader landscape of psychedelic research in Australia, and maybe how we're doing compared to other parts of the world, and what you think the kind of short or medium term future for this work here is.
Okay, I think as somebody who's made a bit of a career of career suicide, I'm in a good position to respond to that question. Look, I think I thank both Chris and Steve for mentioning so many of the research programs that have been happening behind the scenes over the last 10 or more years. So Robin Rod, of course, and Sean Lenahan deserves a mention for his work with MDMA back in the day, and a number of other people have been working quietly behind the scenes. I think we should probably at least acknowledge that there's already an active interest and academic research program happening in Australia, but of course it's opened up dramatically in the last sort of 3 to 4 years, as I think we're able now to ride the wave of global interest in psychedelic medical research and broader psychedelic research. So we're in a good position, and I think although we've lost 30 to 40 years of research into applications of psychedelics and the broader implications of psychedelics, I think we're really in a position to do a lot of that sort of catching up right now. We do have I guess, the benefit of a much greater understanding of neurophysiology, neurochemistry, molecular pharmacology, for example, from the point of view of receptor structure and function, and also neural networks through the brain imaging. So in fact, that sort of lost 30 to 40 years of research has brought us to a point at which we have a much greater understanding, I suspect, of how psychedelics work in the brain, and more broadly in a behavioural sense, and then more broadly again into a sort of a social and socio-political sense. So we're able to consider therapeutic and other and also applications from their neurobiological context, and I think that's really where so much of the research is starting to integrate, to really come back into some sort of coherent and cohesive whole. And so, meanwhile, we're also seeing that medicine is coming to a greater awareness of mind-body factors, as Chris mentioned, in relation to Tom Roberts and other researchers who have been working again overseas for quite a number of years in the field. And this really provides a sort of again a promising integration of all of these research sort of strands. And so I can sort of speak on the medical side of things as I guess as a counterpoint to what Chris and Steve have mentioned on the more social, particularly Chris mentioned on the more philosophical and social sciences side of things, humanities side of things. The therapeutic or medical applications of psychedelics, which are really emerging globally, and I think in Australia we have a contribution to make, are in anxiety and depressive disorders. And those anxiety disorders include obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, body dysmorphia, and so on and so forth. And I think this really represents our greater understanding of all of these conditions as time goes on. I think psychedelics really have a part to play in casting a beam, casting a light on these particular mental health conditions. I'm happy to say that Australia has very active and valuable research going in the non-psychedelic space in all of these areas. There's a whole bunch that I haven't mentioned, of course, but I think we do have the potential now, with a greater acceptance of the value of psychedelic research, to start to shed more light on all of these various areas. Beyond all of that, I think we have the potential to shed light on the general area of wellness. So not even mental health conditions or illness as such, but as people may recall, back in around 2005, 2006, the resurgence in psychedelic research, which involved administration of psychedelics to subjects, was a phase 1 trial at Johns Hopkins University that was coordinated by Bob Jesse, who was a guest of EGA all those years ago, as well as Roland Griffiths and Matt Johnson and so on, administering psilocybin to otherwise mentally fit and well people to gauge the impact on their spiritual sense and their sense of spiritual well-being. And I think that really brings us back in many ways to what was happening in the 60s and even the 50s before that. So we have the potential to re-explore so many of the questions that were left unanswered or only partially answered in that earlier phase of psychedelic research. And I'm happy to say that I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we have the potential to address so many more of those questions globally, but also in Australia, because we have a very active research community here in Australia.
That's really interesting, Martin. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it seems like most of the, the empirical research that we often talk about in Australia, or at least that I come across, is more focused on clinical outcomes rather than wellness outcomes, or just even better understanding of cognition or anything like that. So it's exciting to hear you say that, in the future that there might be scope for more work in these kinds of subfields as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I think I would like to think that PRISM will be in a position to support and nurture more and more of this research as time goes on. It does bring up the question of, I guess, non-profit or public sector funded research compared with the for-profit sector. And I'm sure we'll see a demarcation as time goes on in the next just very brief time, 2 to 3 to 5 years. I suspect that the for-profit sector will be interested primarily in the health field. And I think that will actually liberate the non-profit and public sector to support more speculative research into the broader questions that I just mentioned earlier. So the non-medical applications, which are essentially focusing attention on questions of consciousness and spirituality and broader holistic well-being. And I think those are still equally valid questions to address, and I really hope that we will have an active and fruitful research community sort of following those questions as well.
Excellent, thanks, Martin. So I've got a few more questions now that I'm just going to open up broadly to the panel, and then in a few minutes after that, we'll open up to audience questions. So if you're in the audience and you have something that you want to ask, now's maybe a good time to think about that question, and in a couple of minutes, we can try and get to those. But I'm going to start off and maybe just touch a bit more on the theme that Martin's raised here of future work. And I'm curious what each of you think about what sort of psychedelic research makes the most sense in Australia. Like, what sort of study designs or research questions would you like to see investigated if you had a, benevolent funding body that was going to give you a grant to do whatever kind of psychedelic research that you'd like to? Stephen, what would you do?
I don't know. My head's just spinning the way that you phrase that. A benevolent organisation that's just allowing me to do any research that I want to do. I think it would. I don't know. I think it would. It wouldn't actually be that different to some of the stuff that we're already doing. I'm very passionate about trauma and its comorbidity with AOD. I'd really like to see sort of some of the work that Ben Sess has done in the UK replicated here in Australia. And I feel like a lot of the work we're doing at the moment is groundwork to do this sort of work, so that we can demonstrate we've got people and infrastructure to do that. It would be work that really expands out the work that we're already doing, so that we have more and more therapists trained appropriately to be able to engage in this paradigm changing way of working with people. And in doing so, that might open up it not just from being a research thing, but something where we can sort of look at what's happened in the US and Israel and Switzerland, where there are compassionate access schemes, and they are available because the research has already been done, so it allows a widening of that. So if we could widen the research very quickly so that we had a lot more therapists trained, then I think then we could go down that path of moving it away from just being a focus on research, but increasing the accessibility of these medicines much more broadly. And And the other thing I think would be just what Martin was saying in terms of well-being. You know, I would like to see, and I have to say I'm plagiarising Rick Doblin and a few others here, but there being the opportunity in 10, 20 years' time for there being wellness centres where people could access psychedelic experiences in a controlled environment just to improve their general wellness, to have a spiritual experience. And to be able to do that, like with the therapeutic work, there needs to be the research conducted first so that we understand what it is about, what are the processes, what are the mechanisms that improve people's well-being, how does microdosing work, all of these sorts of things. I think we need to answer these questions so that we can get to that sort of utopic endpoint that that was running through my mind when you posed the question, which is the end goal, that these are medicines that are more widely available to the public, not only as medicines but as ways of people, you know, reflecting on a difficult situation that they're experiencing, somebody that's looking to find a creative solution to a problem. There's all of the stuff we have anecdotes around, having the research to support that so that those things become more available 10, 20 years into the future.
Great, thank you. Wonderful vision. Chris, how about you? What would you like to see? What sort of work would you like to see done?
Yeah, thanks. I was really hoping you were going to throw to me next, because I've got this off the top of my head 3 distinct areas that I would like to see, but one of them comes very directly off what Steve was just saying. So I think the work that's been coming out looking at commonalities between the psychedelic experience and mindfulness meditation is extremely important, both with respect to therapeutic applications and with respect to the betterment of well people. So, you know, there's a series of studies now showing that with no formal mindfulness component or meditation component at all, a single psychedelic experience can lead to elevations in these so-called mindfulness-related capacities for decentering, taking a kind of detached, witnessing, flexible stance towards one's own thoughts and feelings and so on. So there's a whole body of evidence showing that that seems to happen. But then last year, this remarkable study came out of, I think it was Switzerland, Smigielski et al., in which they got a bunch of experienced Zen meditators to do a traditional 5-day retreat. And on day 4 of the retreat, they all, you know, got either psilocybin or placebo in a double-blind fashion and just went about their normal meditation routine. And the ones who got psilocybin had these profound, you know, ego dissolution, oceanic boundlessness experiences with unusually low levels of anxiety. And so the researchers speculate that meditation training protects against some of the possible, negative side effects of psychedelics, kind of gives you the psychological resources you need to navigate these states well. So I would really love to see a replication of that study done in Australia, and I would like to be one of the subjects. But in general, just more research into that, because as I say, I think that's a really important nexus where the clinical and the sort of the wellness applications meet. So 2 other things, I'll try not to go on for too long. One is probing the nature of ego dissolution and its neural correlates in a more fine-grained fashion, because all the studies that have looked at ego dissolution so far have tended to use these fairly coarse-grained unidimensional measures, but it's very clear from qualitative research and narrative phenomenological description that ego dissolution is a profoundly multidimensional thing. And so just even still at a fairly coarse grain, in some of our work together, Phil Gerrans and I have argued, and this is not really our original idea, but that, you know, in some studies you've got ego dissolution correlating with the breakdown of the default mode network in the brain. In other studies you've got it correlating with the breakdown of other networks such as the salience network. Our interpretation is that what's happening is different aspects of self-consciousness are breaking down in these different conditions, depending perhaps on the substance, the dose, the setting, and so on. But that hasn't really been tested rigorously. So I would love to see some studies incorporating neuroimaging that use fine-grained measures so we could actually see which distinct aspects of self-consciousness are being affected and how that correlates with different neural changes. And the final thing is just what I was talking about earlier. So some of these studies to probe the epistemic status of the psychedelic experience in more detail. So as I said, we've got this work with some of the people at Imperial looking at changes to metaphysical beliefs about the mind-body problem. But there are other studies in the works at the moment that look at the effects of psychedelic experiences on people's attitudes towards science, you know, how people view the epistemic credentials of science. I think it would be really interesting to, there are well-validated psychometric measures out there of conspiracy theory type thinking. I think it would be really interesting to see some of those things administered sort of before and after, and to find out what sorts of effects these experiences really have, especially in kind of controlled clinical contexts versus sort of ceremonial contexts, on people's epistemic functioning and their inclinations to different sorts of beliefs about reality.
Great, Chris. There's a lot to potentially unpack there, but I think I'm going to move on, and if we have any questions on it, we'll come back to some of that. Mark, do you have any thoughts on what you would like to see happen in the short, medium, longer term in Australia?
Sure. I would like to thank Chris for pinching my idea. I think I would be very keen to look at research with psychedelic compounds and mindfulness. I think there's an enormous potential in that. Obviously, Chris has done that more poetic justice than I am going to be able to, but I would love to hear more about that, Chris, and maybe speak with you off camera about some of your interests there. I guess one of the things that always comes up for me is, well, recently I was asked, Marg, who do you think psilocybin could be good for? Just using psilocybin as an example, and I said, I think it would be good for existential syndromes. And after a few seconds, she was sort of thinking about it. She said, well, doesn't that kind of underpin a lot of things? And I said, yes, it does. But I do think that the idea of looking at psychedelic compounds in psychological wellness rather than just mental health conditions would be fascinating to me. And, you know, I think I don't think I've looked in many eyes that don't have some degree of existential ache in them. And obviously I work in death. I work with people who are you know, right at the precipice of life and death, and it really kind of brings things into a very sharp view. And I think that there's something that people are searching for. There's some ache that people are really kind of wanting to access, and our traditional kind of our talking therapies and things that just aren't kind of cutting it, and particularly pharmacological, you know, treatments that we've got at the moment, which are just kind of muting people's experiences. You know, they can be very necessary, of course, to keep people safe, but in terms of being able to access some of that really visceral existential angst that a lot of people have, you know, and again, they may not have a depression or an anxiety as such. They may just have a curiosity about it, or they want to expand or deepen their spiritual well-being. You know, I think that there's a lot to be, you know, kind of looking forward to in terms of what the research could tell us here. It's not just for people who have mental health issues, I believe, and I think that I would like to see that kind of, in some way, being addressed in the future.
Great, thank you, Mark. And Martin, you kind of got us started on this line of imagining and investigation, but did you have anything else you wanted to add about thoughts for future studies that will, you know, make your heart happy?
Absolutely. So I think there's still so much to be covered, and so I'm happy to have got the conversation started in this sense. I guess from the strict medical point of view, I'm very interested in the fact that personality disorders are actually a strong, significant exclusion criterion in most of the, if not all of the psychedelic medical clinical trials that have been conducted and completed in the last few years and appear to be sort of ongoing at the moment. So I'd be very interested to see some studies into whether, in fact, personality disorders are actually as difficult to deal with in psychedelic treatment as is generally accepted to be the case. And so I think that leads me into the broader sort of sense of, I guess, for example, the idea, as Chris mentioned, of ego, I think it was Chris, ego dissolution, and whether, for example, in narcissistic personalities, whether there's ego dissolution or actually ego aggrandizement in certain situations. I think it'd be interesting to explore that in a more formal sense and to gauge ultimately whether psychedelic psychotherapy may be of benefit to a range of people whom we currently exclude from these trials. But in the broader social sense, I think I would really love to see, along the lines of Chris's interests and his affiliates' interests in research, the broader societal implications of psychedelics, of psychedelic research, but of course of psychedelic use overall. We're quite involved, I think, as a group in the field of harm minimisation, in terms of societal exploration or use of psychedelics in a non-clinical context. And I personally would really like to see an approachment of those fields of psychedelic medical research with the broader societal use, and see if we can understand the pathology of society's opinions, sort of responses to the psychedelic state. Is that just simply a mistrust and a fear of the unknown, or is it something deeper than that? But I really feel that we have a long way to go to engender and to support a broader societal acceptance, appreciation, and potentially benefit from psychedelic states. So yeah, those are three which interest me in a nutshell. I think that'll keep us going for quite some time to come. So I look forward to seeing the journey.
Yes, indeed. I think we're all going to be very, very busy with all these ideas. So we have just a few minutes left. I'd like to open it up now to if there's any questions in the chat. So if there's anything that anyone out there would like to ask anyone, if you type it in, I'll try and ask it to our panelists. I noted just a couple to get us started. Mark, there was a couple of questions about the music that you use during your sessions. Someone asked if the playlist was available, and someone else asked about how you pick the music or how you choose the music. So if you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share.
Sure. We're doing something a little bit novel, actually, in our study, because one of the things that we've recently just published a paper about this, actually, in the Journal of Music Therapy, is that previous studies, psychedelic intervention studies where music was obviously used, there was actually really scant attention paid to it. So we went back and did a rapid review of studies where they did sort of start talking about it, or participants had an opportunity to do some qualitative kind of reflection on that. And what they found was that, the music can really deepen and expand and amplify one's experience in it. But if they weren't really kind of vibing with it, it could be quite intrusive and quite agitating, actually. So, and as someone who in my old life was kind of trained as a classical musician, what is a standard music playlist? It doesn't actually exist. The way that I hear classical music versus it's so varied. So I think using that standard playlist that, was developed back in the 60s by, Walter Pankey, Helen Bonney, it's a lovely playlist, but it doesn't actually gel with everybody. So then what do we, rather than enhancing states for people, it may actually kind of resist or obstruct them being able to go deeper and surrender to that process under a psychedelic state. So one of the things that we wanted to do was offer 3 playlists to people. So one being similar to what they use sort of at the Johns Hopkins. I know that they've now adapted that, and it's a new one again. But one that they previously used, similar to what they've used at Mendel Kaelin with Imperial College for their depression studies. And then we actually developed one ourselves. So it's the St. Vincent's playlist. Unfortunately, not available at this stage because obviously if it's available to the wider community and then one of our potential participants hears it, then, we're mindful of trying to provide music that's what we classify as B-side bark, if you like. It needs to be relatively unfamiliar to people because otherwise you can bring along with that kind of connotations. Like if that music is very familiar to you, then it may remind you and cue you to previous memories or other states, and that can kind of cloud the process a little bit. We want it to be as open as possible. So what we tried to do was sort of come up with, the therapists all sat down and brought in various bits and pieces that we thought would be good. Again, non-lyric. If there is voice, it's not discerned. So we're trying to kind of keep it as open as possible and not directed in any particular way. So, ambient, world music, what else can I say? A little bit of classical as well. So got some There's one particular who's a local composer. She's an incredible pianist. So we've got a really varied kind of textured playlist that we put together, and it took a long time. And we basically sat down and kind of rated what we thought would work and what wouldn't work, following the mechanism of drug action. So obviously there's the lead in, and then kind of the peak experience, and then as that gentle sort of lifting out and kind of bringing up the vibe of it a little bit more. So we're going to write about this eventually, so I don't want to give away the spoilers, but essentially it was a group process where we kind of methodically went through and rated things in terms of how appropriate we felt it was for. And again, it's always a tricky one. What's going to work for me is going to be different for you. So, but again, I think giving them some degree of I guess direction over that. They get a little snippet of the music playlist about the second preparatory session, so then they can kind of choose what they would feel they would like out of those 3 playlists. The other playlist that we offer to people is just birdsong, because some people may not want music, and so we thought we'd kind of hack our evolutionary responses whereby when you hear birdsong, it kind of tends to sort of settle your sympathetic nervous system, and that things are okay and you can feel relaxed and sort of settled. So if people need to tap out of the music situation, they can actually hear birdsong, so that can kind of offer them another experience again. So I think that we're trying to, I guess, optimize as much as possible how people can experience the sessions, but we absolutely underscore the importance of music and sound in our sessions. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I think that was a really, really comprehensive answer. Yeah, Stephen, did you want to add something?
I was just going to jump in. I think, when we're talking about, how do you become a psychedelic researcher, one of the names I had in mind talking about that was Mendel Kahn, and, basically forging a whole area of psychedelic research in terms of the role of music. But it also just going back to that previous question, I was first off the rung, so I didn't really have much time to think through it. Though I feel like something that we really need to understand is the mechanism of action. Clearly, music is an important part of the mechanism of action when it comes to therapeutic efficacy of these of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but we still don't really understand what the mechanisms of action really are. We're sort of hypothesizing that these things or those things might be key ingredients, but we're still not fully sure about that. So I think it would be really important for future research to help really untangle what those mechanisms are. And I think just on the music aspect, reading Kaelin's work, what really resonated with me personally was the idea that if you're taking a psychedelic drug, at a festival setting, you have the choice. You can actually move away from that music if you don't want it. It really made me cognizant of the fact that if people are in this space, they can't just turn the music off, or they get asked for the therapist to turn the music off, but it makes it much more difficult. And what I thought was really interesting in that qualitative research was that some people said that while they really didn't like the music that they were hearing at the time, it was also very powerful in providing a challenging experience that then turned into a very therapeutic experience, which just circles back on this point that we really don't understand how these things work.
Great, thanks, Stephen. I've got a couple of questions that have come in from the chat that I'd like to pass on. This might be a good one for you, Martin. Felicity asks, as researchers and scientists, how can we ensure that we don't see history repeating itself and see research come to a halt or dramatically slowed down as the wellness industry continues to grow?
So I think really we're very fortunate to be living in quite a different time from the countercultural revolution of the 60s, which really culminated in a closing down of research as a sort of a byproduct, a consequence of the general sort of response of the authorities in the US, primarily, of course, to the anti-Vietnam War movement and so on and so forth. I think we are in quite a different sort of era, but of course, looking at the last 6 to 12 to 18 to 36 months of global history, I think actually we could be going through it all again. So very interesting to watch that in play. I sincerely hope that we're not going to be reenacting the history of the 60s and the early 70s in terms of the heavy-handed, excessive institutional responses to the use of psychedelics, as well as research into psychedelics. Look, I think we've had the good fortune in recent times to have much broader support from other parts of society. It's known as the mainstreaming of psychedelics. And so I think we're seeing a multi-generational acceptance of psychedelics in a sense and to a degree. We shouldn't get too excited or carried away about this. And of course, we mustn't get evangelical in any way about the benefits or the place of psychedelics in society or reality overall, really. I think we need to keep a firm grip on things overall. But all that said, I think we've had the benefit of some very, very good articulate commentators bringing the subject of psychedelics to the broader mindset, and I think that's had a huge impact. And so possibly for the first time in 30 to 40 years, psychedelics are becoming an acceptable subject of dinner table conversations. And I think we're really seeing a much broader interest, acceptance, curiosity about psychedelics, and I guess drugs and altered states more generally as well.
Let me ask. Yeah, I was just going to ask something about that. There was kind of a second part to the question that came through there along those lines, sort of asking about whether, apart from just researchers, if there's a need to be cautious or to encourage caution amongst people who get excited about psychedelics and then maybe, enthusiastic about their use in ways that may not be completely matching what the science tells us. So I wonder if there's any thoughts on that.
Absolutely, very good question. Look, I think, as I said a moment ago, there's perhaps a natural tendency for people to become a little evangelical once they've sort of seen the light, so to speak. And I think it's important for people to maintain a sort of a broader perspective, and also a broader perspective of their own place and the place of their own thoughts in the broader societal context. So I think that's quite important. On the other hand, I was just trying to remember the old Tim Leary quote that psychedelics cause anxiety primarily in people who have never taken them. And so
I think it was psychotic delusional reactions or something along those lines.
There you go. Perfect, yeah. So the first thing that many people who have taken psychedelics would like is to pop it in the drinking water and then have society at large at least see what these people are experiencing. I think that's a very valid but rather blue sky concept, and so we are going through a somewhat more measured and well-considered strategy, I think, to bring about a broader understanding. And I think we ultimately still have so much more to learn ourselves. So there's no question that psychedelics do carry risks for certain people. Overuse of psychedelics can carry risks for a lot of people. So I think we need to make sure that we keep things in perspective overall, both at the personal and the societal level.
Thanks, Martin. Maybe time for just one or two more questions. There was one interesting one that came in. I'm not sure who this is best to ask for, so maybe raise your hand if you've got a thought on this. But someone asked if, do you think that psychedelic therapy has a place in custodial settings, and what would be the differences in comparison to, other forms of psychedelic therapy?
So an early study was the Tim Leary and Walter Pankey study of that was called the Concord PRISM experiment. Is that correct? And so I believe that psilocybin was administered to inmates of Concord Prison in California. And so although the study had significant methodological limitations, unfortunately, I think ultimately it still represented a positive outcome for the potential use of psychedelics in a custodial prison setting overall. So, Chris, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in there and say I'm not 100% certain, but I think it goes further than methodological limitations. I think it's been fairly conclusively shown that Leary actually fudged the data.
Okay, interesting.
So I think I don't know.
Polite.
Well, I mean, I guess I would want to be very cautious about inferring anything from that at all from that study, except the mere that the idea is there. But there are these recent epidemiological studies by Peter Hendricks and other people showing that lifetime use of psychedelics is correlated with reduced recidivism among various categories of offenders. So, to my mind, that makes a stronger case for investigating that than the Concord study.
Yeah, I don't know the research super well, but I know also that there has been some research in Brazil administering ayahuasca to prison inmates that I believe had quite positive impact. So that would be an angle to look up if you're interested in that. I can't remember the research off the top of my head, but I might try and find it after this call and put it in the chat.
Actually, just briefly as well, there's several sort of long-running projects among various Buddhist lineages of going into prisons and teaching prisoners mindfulness and meditation. So there's, again, another sort of potential point of synergy there to explore the interactions between psychedelics, mindfulness, or meditation.
Yeah. Okay, we're pretty much out of time. I just want to pop in one last question. A couple of people asked, Marg, if your study is still taking applications or if there are ways that people with a need can get into that trial.
Absolutely. I think it's worthwhile mentioning though, because I get a lot of inquiries from people who are not actually terminally ill. So at the moment, our current study is for people who have a terminal illness, who have depression or anxiety as a result of their terminal illness. We are absolutely taking more people. We still have a way to go. At the moment, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we're still on hold because of COVID, but we do hope to recommence very soon. But people can contact us at the email is psilocybinstudy@svha.org.au, and I can put that up. If people are interested, they can contact us there, and we'll be in contact with them as soon as possible.
Great, thanks, Marg. And I think that's pretty much time. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Chris, Stephen, Marg, Martin. That was a really interesting panel. And thank you very much to EGA for hosting us and having us on today. And I think we're going to sign out now. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.